The moment a stranger speaks your native language thousands of miles from home, they stop being a stranger. The entire private dining room fell silent the instant Sophia Bennett began speaking. A distinguished businessman from Eastern Europe slowly lowered his coffee cup, his eyes widening with disbelief. Around the table, executives exchanged confused glances. Across the room, millionaire Charles Whitmore stared at the waitress as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Sophia spoke calmly, effortlessly, her voice carrying a warmth and precision that transformed the atmosphere in seconds. The elderly businessman suddenly smiled. Then he laughed softly. A moment later, he stood and embraced Sophia like a long-lost friend. Nobody in the room understood what had just happened. Nobody except Sophia. 3 hours earlier, everything had looked very different. The Sterling House occupied the top floor of a historic Manhattan building overlooking Central Park. Known for discretion and impeccable service, the restaurant attracted diplomats, celebrities, and corporate leaders from around the world. Sophia had worked there for nearly 4 years. At 34, she had become one of the restaurant's most respected servers. She never forgot a customer's preferences. She remembered anniversaries, dietary restrictions, favorite wines, and even the names of customers' children. Guests often requested her section specifically. Yet despite her reputation, very few people knew much about her personal life. Sophia rarely discussed herself. She arrived early, worked quietly, and always carried a small leather notebook inside her apron pocket. During slower moments, she occasionally wrote inside it. Nobody asked why. On a rainy Thursday evening, Charles Whitmore arrived for an important dinner with several international investors. Charles, 52, had built a fortune through global investments and strategic acquisitions. Confident and highly respected, he possessed a sharp intellect and little patience for exaggeration. He expected excellence from everyone around him. Sophia greeted the group with her usual calm professionalism. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. Your usual sparkling water." Charles looked pleasantly surprised. "You remember?" Sophia smiled. "You prefer it without lemon." One of the investors laughed. "You must have an incredible memory." Sophia simply nodded. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere relaxed. Discussion shifted from business to travel. One guest described difficulties communicating during a recent trip to South America. Another joked that Americans rarely spoke more than one language. Sophia happened to be refilling water glasses nearby when Charles casually asked, "What about you, Sophia? Do you speak any other languages?" Sophia hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "Actually, I speak 9. The room immediately grew quiet. Several guests looked up from their meals. Charles raised an eyebrow. 9. Sophia nodded politely. "Yes, sir." A smile slowly appeared on Charles's face. 9 languages? He repeated, clearly amused. "That is impressive." His tone suggested otherwise. One investor chuckled. Another smiled politely. Charles leaned back in his chair. "Let me guess. You know how to order coffee in 9 languages." Soft laughter spread around the table. Sophia remained perfectly composed. "No, sir," she said gently. "I speak them fluently." This time several guests laughed openly. Charles shook his head with a smile. "Sophia, I work internationally. Fluency at that level takes decades." Sophia simply returned his smile. Sometimes life gives us unusual opportunities to learn. Charles exchanged amused glances with his colleagues. "Well," he said, lifting his wine glass, "perhaps later you can demonstrate." Sophia nodded respectfully. "If necessary." Then she quietly walked away. None of the men noticed that she seemed neither embarrassed nor offended. She merely continued serving the room with the same grace as before. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking Manhattan. Inside, conversations resumed. But before the night ended, every person in that room would discover that Sophia Bennett had not exaggerated a single word. For the next hour, Charles Whitmore gave little additional thought to Sophia Bennett's claim. The conversation at the table gradually returned to mergers, market forecasts, and international expansion plans. Expensive wine flowed freely. Soft piano music drifted through the private dining room. Yet every so often, one of the guests glanced toward Sophia as she moved gracefully between tables. There was something unusual about her composure. Most people who had been openly doubted in front of a room full of executives would have shown embarrassment, irritation, or at least discomfort. Sophia showed none of those things. She simply continued working. Half an hour later, the first surprise arrived. A Japanese family entered the restaurant looking visibly anxious. The elderly grandfather appeared frustrated, while the younger family members repeatedly checked reservation confirmations on their phones. The hostess struggled politely, but communication proved difficult. The family had accidentally booked for the following evening. The misunderstanding quickly created confusion. Charles noticed the scene immediately because it was unfolding only a few feet from his table. Before the situation could escalate, Sophia quietly stepped forward. She bowed respectfully and addressed the elderly gentleman in flawless Japanese. The transformation was immediate. The man's worried expression disappeared. His eyes widened. Within seconds, he began responding enthusiastically. Sophia listened carefully, occasionally nodding and smiling warmly. The conversation continued naturally for several minutes. Nearby staff members watched with open curiosity. Finally, Sophia guided the family toward a newly prepared table. As they sat down, the grandfather stood and thanked her repeatedly while bowing deeply. The entire interaction had unfolded so smoothly that it almost seemed rehearsed. One of Charles's investors lowered his fork slowly. "Was that Japanese?" he asked. Charles nodded cautiously. It sounded convincing. Another executive laughed nervously. Perhaps she memorized a few hospitality phrases. Charles remained silent. He was no expert in Japanese, but he had spent enough time in Tokyo to recognize authentic fluency when he heard it. Before he could process the experience fully, another unexpected moment arrived. French. Couple dining near the windows requested assistance with the wine list. Sophia approached their table and immediately transitioned into elegant French. The couple visibly relaxed. Soon they were laughing together as if speaking with an old friend. 20 minutes later, an Italian businessman requested directions to a nearby theater. Sophia responded effortlessly in Italian. Later still, she welcomed German tourists in flawless German. Each transition occurred naturally. No hesitation. No searching for words. No signs of performance. Charles found himself watching Sophia more than his own guests. The room seemed different now. Every international customer who encountered Sophia experienced the same reaction. Surprise followed by gratitude. One investor finally shook his head in disbelief. How many languages did she say she spoke? 9, Charles answered quietly. Nobody laughed this time. During dessert service, Charles stopped Sophia as she refilled coffee cups. "Sophia," he said carefully, "where exactly did you learn all these languages?" Sophia hesitated briefly. "My parents worked for the State Department when I was growing up." Several guests immediately looked interested. Sophia continued politely. "We moved frequently. Brussels, Geneva, Tokyo, Vienna, Madrid. My parents believed learning languages was a way of respecting people." Charles studied her thoughtfully. "That still does not explain 9 languages." Sophia smiled softly. "Life is long if you remain curious." Before Charles could ask another question, Sophia excused herself to assist another table. As she walked away, one of the investors leaned toward Charles. "You know," he said quietly, "I think we may have underestimated her." Charles stared across the dining room. For the first time that evening, he realized he knew almost nothing about the woman serving their dinner. And somehow, he suspected the most surprising part of Sophia Bennett's story had not yet been revealed. By 9 o'clock, the rain outside had intensified, turning the windows of the Sterling house into shimmering walls of silver and gold. Inside the private dining room, however, a different kind of atmosphere had begun to emerge. Curiosity had quietly replaced amusement. Charles Whitmore noticed it first among his guests. Earlier that evening, they had smiled politely when Sophia Bennett claimed to speak 9 languages. Now, every time she crossed the room, conversation seemed to pause. People watched her differently. Not because she demanded attention, but because she never did. Sophia moved through the restaurant with the same calm grace she had displayed all evening. She adjusted place settings, refilled glasses, and checked on guests with genuine warmth. Yet something about her presence now felt almost mysterious. Charles had spent decades evaluating people. His success depended on recognizing talent quickly. Normally, he trusted his instincts without hesitation. Tonight, for the first time in years, he began to question them. The next surprise arrived unexpectedly. A middle-aged couple seated near the fireplace appeared increasingly distressed while examining the menu. Their accent suggested Eastern Europe, though none of the staff could identify the language. Sophia approached their table carrying fresh bread. Within seconds, she began speaking to them in their native tongue. The effect was immediate. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table and squeezed Sophia's hand affectionately. The husband smiled broadly and said something that caused Sophia to laugh softly. When Sophia eventually returned to Charles's table, one of the investors could no longer contain his curiosity. "What language was that?" he asked. "Romanian," Sophia answered simply. Charles set down his coffee cup. "Romanian?" Sophia nodded. "Yes, sir." Charles studied her carefully. "You speak Japanese, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Romanian fluently." Sophia smiled gently. "Among others." "That still leaves several more," Charles said. Before Sophia could respond, the restaurant manager suddenly appeared beside her. "Sophia, would you mind helping in the reception area?" he asked quietly. "We have a situation." Sophia immediately excused herself. Charles watched as she disappeared across the restaurant. Less than 5 minutes later, raised voices could be heard from the entrance. The private dining room grew noticeably quieter. Through the partially open doors, Charles could see an elderly gentleman dressed in an elegant dark suit speaking rapidly and emotionally. Two hosts looked overwhelmed. Nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Then Sophia stepped into view. The moment the elderly gentleman saw her, everything changed. Sophia greeted him in a language Charles had never heard before. The man's expression transformed instantly from frustration to astonishment. He answered rapidly. Sophia listened attentively, occasionally responding with remarkable fluency. Their conversation continued for several minutes. Finally, the gentleman smiled warmly. To everyone's surprise, he placed his hand over his heart and bowed respectfully toward Sophia before allowing the host to escort him to his table. Silence settled across the room. Even from a distance, everyone had sensed something extraordinary. When Sophia eventually returned, Charles spoke immediately. "What language was that?" Sophia hesitated for only a moment. "Rusin," she answered softly. Several guests exchanged confused glances. One investor frowned. "I have never heard of it." Sophia nodded. "Very few people have. It is a minority language spoken in parts of Eastern Europe." Charles stared at her. "You speak Rusin fluently?" "Yes." "Why?" Sophia looked toward the elderly gentleman now dining peacefully across the restaurant. "Because language is not only words," she said quietly. "Sometimes it is memory. Sometimes it is home." For several seconds nobody spoke. Charles suddenly realized that Sophia Bennett had never claimed to speak 9 languages in order to impress anyone. She had stated it as a simple fact. And somehow, that realization made the truth even more remarkable. Yet Charles still had no idea that before the evening ended, Sophia would reveal a secret capable of changing everything he believed about her. The private dining room remained unusually quiet long after Sophia Bennett returned to her duties. Even the investors who had spent the evening discussing billion-dollar transactions now seemed distracted. Charles Whitmore noticed it in their faces. The conversation no longer centered on markets or acquisitions. It centered on Sophia. "How does someone even learn Rusin?" one executive asked softly. Another shook his head. "I have negotiated across Europe for 20 years. I have never met anyone who speaks it." Charles said nothing. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, he felt genuinely puzzled by another person. Near 10 o'clock, dessert plates had been cleared, coffee had been served, and the evening appeared to be winding down. Then Charles's assistant hurried into the private dining room carrying a tablet. Her expression immediately caught his attention. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "there is a problem." Charles excused himself from the table. After listening for several moments, his expression changed noticeably. The investors watched with concern. One of the most important guests attending the dinner, Viktor Petrov, a prominent investor from Eastern Europe, had just arrived unexpectedly from the airport. Severe weather had delayed his flight, and his team had been unable to reach him. Worse, Victor spoke very limited English. Charles had arranged for a professional interpreter, but the interpreter remained stranded in New Jersey because of flooding caused by the storm. How long until the interpreter arrives? Charles asked. His assistant looked uncomfortable. At least 2 hours. Charles checked his watch. Victor's return flight departed shortly after midnight. Without tonight's meeting, months of negotiations could collapse. Charles rarely showed stress publicly, yet several guests immediately recognized it in his face. "Can we reschedule?" someone asked. Charles shook his head. "Impossible. He leaves for Warsaw tonight and will be traveling for the next 6 weeks." The room fell silent. Then one investor looked toward the dining room entrance. "What about Sophia?" he asked carefully. Charles hesitated. The suggestion seemed almost unreasonable. Yet after everything he had witnessed that evening, dismissing the idea no longer felt wise. Before Charles could respond, the restaurant manager entered accompanied by Sophia herself. "Mr. Whitmore," the manager said, "Sophia mentioned she might be able to help." Charles looked directly at her. "You speak Polish?" Sophia smiled gently. "Yes." Charles exhaled slowly. "Fluently." Sophia nodded. "Completely." 20 minutes later, Viktor Petrov arrived. The distinguished businessman entered carrying a rain-soaked coat and visible exhaustion. Charles greeted him warmly, but communication remained difficult. Viktor answered politely, though confusion appeared almost immediately. Then Sophia stepped forward. In flawless Polish, she welcomed him to New York, apologized for the weather, and asked about his flight. Viktor froze. For several seconds he simply stared at her. Then a broad smile spread across his face. He answered enthusiastically. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Throughout the next 90 minutes, Sophia remained beside the table, interpreting not only language but meaning. She clarified cultural references, explained subtle expressions, and occasionally prevented misunderstandings before they occurred. At one point, Victor made a humorous remark rooted in Polish history. Without missing a beat, Sophia translated both the joke and its cultural significance. The entire table laughed together. Charles watched in astonishment. This was not merely language proficiency. This was mastery. As the meeting concluded, Victor stood and addressed the room in Polish. Sophia translated quietly. "Mr. Petrov says this is the first international negotiation he has attended where he truly felt understood." The room became still. Victor then turned toward Sophia directly and spoke again. This time Sophia did not translate immediately. "What did he say?" Charles asked softly. Sophia smiled modestly. "He asked where I studied conference interpretation." Charles stared at her. "Conference interpretation?" After a brief hesitation, Sophia finally answered. "I spent several years working as an interpreter for international organizations in Geneva before my mother became ill." Nobody spoke. Suddenly the entire evening made sense. And Charles realized with growing disbelief that the woman he had laughed at hours earlier had once occupied rooms far more important than his own. The revelation lingered over the private dining room long after Viktor Petrov departed. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, but inside the Sterling house, something far more significant had changed. Charles Whitmore sat quietly, staring into the last inch of coffee remaining in his cup. Around him, conversations had resumed, yet they carried an entirely different tone. Earlier that evening, Sophia Bennett had been the pleasant waitress with an impressive memory. Now she had become an enigma. A woman who spoke 9 languages fluently. A former conference interpreter who had once worked in Geneva. Someone who moved effortlessly between cultures and continents, yet now spent her evenings serving dinner in Manhattan. The contradiction fascinated everyone. As the guests prepared to leave, Victor approached Sophia one final time. Through tears of gratitude, he thanked her in Polish for rescuing a meeting he believed would fail. Sophia translated only part of his words for the table. "Mr. Petrov says tonight reminded him of home," she said softly. Victor smiled warmly and shook his head. "No," he replied in English, searching carefully for each word. Tonight reminded me that extraordinary people still exist. The room fell silent again. Charles watched Sophia closely. She seemed slightly embarrassed by the praise. I only translated, she said gently. Victor left. No. You understood. After Victor departed, the remaining investors slowly gathered their coats. Several stopped specifically to thank Sophia. One executive from California handed her a business card. If you ever decide to return to international consulting, please call me, he said sincerely. Sophia accepted the card politely. Thank you. She slipped it into her apron pocket beside the small leather notebook she always carried. Nearly midnight had arrived by the time the private dining room emptied. Charles remained behind longer than usual. As Sophia cleared the final coffee cups, he approached her. For the first time that evening, there was no amusement in his expression. Sophia, he said quietly, may I ask you something? She nodded. Of course. Charles hesitated. Why are you working here? Sophia continued, stacking plates carefully before answering. Because this is where I need to be. Charles frowned slightly. You could work anywhere in the world. Sophia smiled softly. Perhaps. Then why not? For several seconds she remained silent. Finally, she looked toward the rain-streaked windows overlooking Manhattan. 5 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease, she said gently. I returned to New York to care for her. Charles immediately understood. Sophia continued. Conference interpretation required constant international travel. My mother needed stability. She needed someone present. Charles lowered his eyes. So you gave up your career? Sophia shook her head. No. She smiled thoughtfully. I changed careers. Charles looked confused. Sophia glanced around the restaurant. Every person who walks through these doors arrives carrying a story. Different languages. Different cultures. Different memories. She touched the notebook inside her apron pocket. I have learned as much here as I ever learned in Geneva. Charles noticed the notebook immediately. You are always writing in that book. Sophia laughed softly. Occupational habit. What do you write? She hesitated. Then, surprisingly, she handed him the notebook. Charles opened it carefully. Every page contained observations, cultural customs, translations, notes about human behavior, reflections on communication, quotes gathered from conversations across dozens of languages. One sentence, written neatly across an entire page, captured his attention. People rarely misunderstand words. They misunderstand experiences. Charles read it twice. You wrote this? Sophia nodded. Years ago. Charles slowly closed the notebook and returned it. You know, he said quietly, I think you are wasting your talent here. Sophia smiled with surprising warmth. Mr. Whitmore, talent is never wasted when it helps people feel understood. Charles stood silently as her words settled over him. For the second time that evening, Sophia Bennett had left him without an answer. And somewhere deep inside, Charles began to suspect that the woman serving coffee in Manhattan might possess wisdom far more valuable than anything discussed inside corporate boardrooms. The conversation stayed with Charles Whitmore long after he left the Sterling House that night. As his car moved slowly through rain-soaked Manhattan streets, he found himself thinking not about contracts or investors, but about Sophia Bennett. More specifically, he thought about the sentence written inside her notebook. People rarely misunderstand words. They misunderstand experiences. For reasons he could not explain, the words refused to leave him. During the following weeks, Charles returned to the Sterling House more often than usual. Officially, he told himself he simply appreciated the restaurant's atmosphere. Unofficially, he was curious. Each visit revealed something new about Sophia. One evening, Charles arrived with a delegation from South Korea. Before he could introduce Sophia, she greeted the guests in flawless Korean. Another night, she effortlessly assisted an elderly Spanish couple who had become separated from their tour group. On yet another occasion, Charles watched in amazement as Sophia calmed a nervous child by speaking softly in Dutch, the child's native language. Yet what impressed Charles most was not Sophia's linguistic ability. It was the effect she had on people. Guests consistently relaxed around her. Tension disappeared. Strangers smiled. People seem to feel seen. One Thursday evening, Charles arrived alone. The restaurant was unusually quiet. Sophia brought his sparkling water without being asked. "Long day?" she asked gently. Charles smiled faintly. "You can tell." Sophia nodded. "You have not looked at your phone once since arriving." Charles laughed softly. "Apparently I am becoming predictable." Sophia placed the menu beside him. Predictable is not always a bad thing. Charles hesitated. "May I ask you something personal?" Sophia considered for a moment before nodding. "You said your mother has Alzheimer's disease." "Yes." "How is she?" Sophia smiled, though sadness briefly crossed her face. "Some days are easier than others." She looked toward the window thoughtfully. Lately she remembers languages more clearly than names. Charles frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Sophia sat briefly across from him since the restaurant remained nearly empty. "Last month, she forgot who I was for almost an hour." Charles immediately saw the pain behind her calm expression. Sophia continued softly. "Then suddenly she began singing a French lullaby she used to sing when I was a child in Brussels." She smiled. For a few minutes everything returned. Charles remained silent. "Language can be extraordinary," Sophia said quietly. "Sometimes memories disappear in one language but survive in another." Charles listened carefully. He realized Sophia had not spent years studying languages merely as academic exercises. For her, language represented identity, memory, family, and belonging. "That is why you stayed," Charles said quietly. Sophia nodded. "My mother spent her life helping me understand the world. Remaining with her felt simple." Charles lowered his eyes. In that moment, he remembered missing countless family events during his own rise to success. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, important moments sacrificed for business meetings. The realization unsettled him. Their conversation was interrupted when the restaurant manager approached carrying a large envelope. "Sophia," he said, smiling broadly, "this arrived for you." Sophia looked surprised. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested an elegant invitation embossed with a gold seal. Charles noticed her expression change immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked. Sophia stared silently at the invitation before finally speaking. "The International Conference on Multilingual Communication," she said softly. Charles recognized the event instantly. It was among the most prestigious language conferences in the world. "They want me to deliver the keynote address." Charles looked genuinely astonished. "That is remarkable." Sophia smiled uncertainly. "I have not attended in years." "Will you accept?" Charles asked. Sophia looked down at the invitation. "I do not know." Charles studied her thoughtfully. "Sophia," he said quietly, "if there is one thing I have learned recently, it is that extraordinary gifts are meant to be shared." Sophia looked at him with surprise. Neither of them realized that accepting that invitation would soon reveal a truth far greater than either expected. 3 weeks later, Sophia Bennett stood backstage inside the Grand Lexington Conference Center overlooking downtown Manhattan. The International Conference on Multilingual Communication had drawn scholars, diplomats, interpreters, and language specialists from more than 40 countries. Sophia adjusted the sleeve of her navy dress and took a slow breath. She had almost declined the invitation. Caring for her mother, working full-time at the Sterling House, and returning to a world she had left years earlier had felt overwhelming. Yet somehow she had said yes. Earlier that morning, Charles Whitmore had surprised her by arriving at the restaurant carrying a small gift. Inside the package rested a beautiful fountain pen engraved with a simple message. "Every language deserves a voice." Sophia had smiled when she read it. "Thank you," she had said softly. Charles had shrugged awkwardly. "I thought keynote speakers probably need respectable pens." Now, as conference staff prepared the auditorium, Sophia looked across the crowd through a gap in the curtain. More than 2,000 attendees filled the enormous hall. Near the front sat ambassadors, university presidents, and representatives from international organizations. To Sophia's surprise, Charles occupied a seat near the center aisle. When he noticed her backstage, he offered an encouraging nod. Minutes later, the conference host stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, Our keynote speaker has dedicated her career to building understanding across cultures. Please welcome former international conference interpreter and intercultural communication specialist Sophia Bennett. Applause echoed throughout the auditorium as Sophia walked calmly toward the podium. The room fell silent. Sophia looked across the audience for several seconds before speaking. The most important language we ever learn, she began softly, is the language that makes another human being feel less alone. The audience listened intently. Sophia shared stories from Geneva, Brussels, Tokyo, and New York. She described interpreting difficult negotiations, comforting frightened travelers, and helping families reconnect across cultural barriers. Yet her most powerful stories came from the Sterling House. She spoke about elderly immigrants who had not heard their native language in decades. She described the relief on faces when someone finally understood them. Language, Sophia said quietly, is rarely about vocabulary. It is about dignity. The audience remained completely still. Then, midway through her presentation, Sophia displayed a photograph of her mother. When my mother became ill, she explained, she gradually lost names, dates, and places. But she never forgot the lullabies she learned as a child in France. Her voice softened. Those songs became bridges back to us. Many attendees wiped away tears. Charles sat motionless. He suddenly understood why Sophia viewed language differently than everyone else he had ever met. For her, language represented memory itself. As the keynote concluded, the audience rose in a thunderous standing ovation. The applause continued for nearly 2 full minutes. Sophia smiled gratefully and prepared to leave the stage. Then the conference chair unexpectedly returned to the podium. Before Ms. Bennett departs, he announced, there is one more surprise. A large screen illuminated behind them. Images from Sophia's earlier career appeared. Photographs showed her interpreting at diplomatic summits, humanitarian conferences, and international assemblies. The audience gasped. Charles stared in disbelief. Finally, the chair spoke again. Few people know that Sophia Bennett received the International Excellence in Interpretation Award 7 years ago, an honor considered among the highest distinctions in our profession. The auditorium erupted once more. Sophia looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. After the ceremony ended, journalists surrounded her immediately. Charles waited quietly near the exit. When Sophia finally approached, he shook his head slowly. You never mentioned any of this. Sophia smiled gently. You never asked. Charles laughed softly. Then his expression grew serious. Sophia, he said quietly, I owe you an apology that is long overdue. Sophia looked at him curiously. Neither realized that their conversation that evening would change both of their lives forever. The conference center gradually emptied as evening settled over Manhattan. Journalists packed away cameras. Delegates exchanged business cards in dozens of languages. Yet Charles Whitmore remained near the lobby entrance, waiting patiently. When Sophia Bennett finally emerged after completing a final interview, she looked pleasantly surprised to see him still there. You stayed, she said softly. Charles smiled. I thought the conversation we started deserved a proper ending. Sophia glanced toward the city lights beyond the glass walls. There is a coffee shop across the street that stays open late. 20 minutes later, they sat beside a large window overlooking Lexington Avenue. Rain had returned, falling gently against the glass. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet felt comfortable. Finally Charles set down his coffee cup. Sophia, the first night we met, I laughed at you. Sophia looked at him calmly. Yes, she said simply. Charles nodded. I have replayed that moment many times. He looked down briefly. I told myself I was questioning an unlikely claim. The truth is, I was judging the person making it. Sophia remained silent. Charles continued. I saw a waitress carrying water glasses, and I assumed I understood the limits of your world. He shook his head slowly. I was completely wrong. Sophia studied him for several seconds. Then she smiled gently. Most people do not apologize for things that reveal uncomfortable truths about themselves. Charles looked surprised. You are not angry? Sophia glanced out the window. No. Why not? Sophia considered the question carefully. Because your reaction was not unique. She folded her hands around her coffee cup. People often confuse circumstances with capability. Uniforms make them comfortable. Titles make them comfortable. Categories make life easier. She smiled softly. The problem is that human beings rarely fit neatly inside categories. Charles laughed quietly. You always speak as if every sentence belongs in a book. Sophia laughed for the first time that evening. Occupational hazard. Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. They spoke about childhood memories, travel, family, and regret. Charles admitted that he had missed much of his personal life while building his company. Sophia spoke honestly about caring for her mother and the difficult transition away from international interpreting. At one point, Charles asked a question that had troubled him for weeks. Do you ever regret leaving Geneva? Sophia thought for a long moment. Sometimes, she admitted. There are days when I miss conference halls and international negotiations. She smiled thoughtfully. But then my mother remembers a childhood song, or tells me a story she has not shared in years. Her expression softened. Those moments are priceless. Charles nodded quietly. He understood. Before leaving, Sophia excused herself briefly to answer a telephone call. When she returned, tears glistened in her eyes. Charles immediately looked concerned. Is everything all right? Sophia smiled through her emotion. My neighbor called. My mother recognized me immediately tonight. She laughed softly. Apparently she spent an hour telling everyone in her care facility that her daughter speaks too many languages. Charles laughed warmly. She sounds remarkable. Sophia nodded. She is. As they prepared to leave, Charles hesitated. Sophia, there is something else I should tell you. She looked at him curiously. Your keynote changed something for me. Charles adjusted his coat slowly. Last week, I established a scholarship program through my foundation. Sophia looked surprised. For language students? Charles shook his head. For people whose talents are overlooked because of circumstance. Sophia remained silent. The program is called the Bennett Fellowship, Charles said quietly. For perhaps the first time since they met, Sophia seemed genuinely speechless. Finally she smiled. That is unnecessary. Charles returned her smile. No. It is overdue. As they stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night, neither noticed that the distance between Millionaire and Waitress had quietly disappeared. What remained instead was something far more valuable. Mutual respect. And sometimes, respect is the beginning of every important friendship. Nearly a year passed and life settled into a rhythm neither Sophia Bennett nor Charles Whitmore could have predicted on that rainy evening at the Sterling house. Sophia continued working at the restaurant 3 evenings each week, not because she needed the income, but because she genuinely loved the people. The remaining days belonged to her mother, to occasional consulting work, and increasingly, to speaking engagements around the country. News of her keynote at the International Conference on Multilingual Communication had spread quickly. Universities invited her to speak. Cultural organizations sought her advice. Yet despite growing recognition, Sophia remained unchanged. She still carried the same worn leather notebook inside her apron pocket. She still arrived early for every shift. She still believed that listening mattered more than speaking. Charles changed as well. Colleagues noticed it first. The famously impatient billionaire had become noticeably more attentive. During meetings, he interrupted less and listened more. He began spending time with entry-level employees throughout his company. Several executives were startled when Charles personally attended orientation sessions for new hires. Talent does not announce itself, he told his leadership team one morning. Sometimes it arrives wearing a uniform. The Bennett Fellowship expanded rapidly. What began as a small scholarship program eventually supported students from dozens of backgrounds. Former waiters, retail employees, caregivers, and immigrants received educational opportunities because one millionaire had learned an unforgettable lesson inside a Manhattan restaurant. One autumn afternoon, Charles invited Sophia to attend the first annual fellowship ceremony. The event took place in a sunlit auditorium overlooking the Hudson River. More than 100 scholarship recipients filled the seats. Many had overcome extraordinary obstacles. Some had worked night shifts while attending school. Others had cared for family members while pursuing degrees. Sophia listened to their stories. She quietly wiped away tears. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Charles unexpectedly invited Sophia onto the stage. The audience immediately applauded. Charles waited for silence before speaking. "A year ago," he began, "I believed intelligence looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, and occupied certain rooms." He glanced toward Sophia. "I was wrong." The room grew still. "Someone taught me that wisdom often appears where we least expect it." Charles smiled warmly. "More importantly, she taught me that understanding another person begins the moment we stop assuming we already know their story." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Sophia looked genuinely overwhelmed. When the applause finally subsided, she stepped toward the microphone. "Languages have given me many gifts," she said softly. "But the greatest gift has never been communication." She paused. "It has been humility, because the more people you truly understand, the harder it becomes to judge them." Silence filled the auditorium. Then applause returned once more. Later that evening, Sophia visited her mother at the care facility. As usual, she brought tea and photographs from recent events. To Sophia's surprise, her mother appeared unusually alert. She studied one photograph showing Sophia and Charles standing together at the scholarship ceremony. "Who is this gentleman?" her mother asked. Sophia smiled. "A friend." Her mother nodded thoughtfully. "He looks like someone who learned something important." Sophia laughed softly. "He did." Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "So did you." Sophia looked surprised. "What did I learn?" Her mother smiled with rare clarity. "That people are languages too." For a moment neither spoke. Outside the window, evening sunlight reflected across the city skyline. Sophia thought back to that first rainy night when a millionaire had laughed at her claim. She realized now that the evening had never truly been about 9 languages. It had always been about something far more difficult. Learning to see another human being clearly. And sometimes the most extraordinary truth is not how many languages someone speaks. It is how deeply they understand the human heart.